we're going to talk about why grief is so much more intense when someone's lost someone to suicide. And I think that's important that survivors as well as providers have the opportunity to see what makes suicide different from any other form of grief. Because, quite frankly, people aren't getting it. Our providers, after a few months of working with someone, believes that our survivors should be over it. And what happens when you say, aren't you over it yet? You're not validating that that person loved someone. It's very difficult to come home one day and have to take the rope and slice the rope and pull your child from a tree and try to resuscitate him after he's hung himself. It's very difficult to try to get over the fact that you walk into your house and there's your husband laying on the floor with a gunshot wound to their head. These are things we don't get over. These are horrible traumatic events that we try to learn to live with, but clearly, we're not going to get over it. And so what makes suicide more different than other forms of grief? Well, I think the first thing we have to look at is it's more intense. The grief is extremely complicated. Suicide carries a horrible taboo in our society. We still fail to recognize that 90% of people who take their own lives had a mental health issue. So another thing that makes this so difficult is there's a very strong and abnormal feeling of guilt that accompanies losing someone to suicide. We do that continuous, I should have, could have, would have, and we do that with any kind of death. And it's hard to try to heal when we're feeling so incredibly guilty. So what makes the suicide grief different is we are dealing with really abnormal levels of guilt and shame. Very typical for people who have found the body is the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is very difficult. There is a lot of symptoms that accompany PTSD, and recovering from PTSD is an ongoing, daily, gradual process. It just doesn't happen through a sudden insight or a cure. And healing has to take its time when there's PTSD. When a trauma survivor takes direct action to help cope them with their problems, oftentimes they feel better. But PTSD is incredible. And these people have to learn how to manage their trauma-related emotions and find a way to cope with PTSD. Now, some of the symptoms of PTSD is the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the reliving it and re-seeing it in your head all the time. And so, it's important to make sure that we are really aware, and should be one of the first things that people ask the survivor is if they found the body. If you are a survivor, know that PTSD does take time, and talk to someone who specializes in PTSD. What are the symptoms of complicated grief? You're hearing me say the word complicated grief a lot, but how do we know if our loved one is having a complicated grief issue, if we're having complicated grief? And so, what are some of the telltale signs of that? Well, there's an intense longing for the person that died, and there's very intrusive thoughts or images of your loved one. Very important that there's oftentimes a denial of the death, and there's a real big sense of disbelief. Another sign you might want to look at is there is an extreme anger and bitterness over the loss. And I don't mean, we know that anger is part of the grief process, but we're talking extreme anger or bitterness towards the loved one, towards the family, or towards yourself over the loss. And the other thing is, there's a lot of consequences of being a survivor. What we've noticed with our survivors is oftentimes their physical health suffers. Many survivors experience chronic health issues such as high blood pressure, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, diabetes, chronic pain, mental health issues like anxiety or depression or seclusion. They start going inward, so they start lacking support with their community. They start taking more risky behaviors and suicide ideology. Their self-esteem starts to deteriorate. They begin to hate themselves as well as others, and their trust begins to deplete. And this all takes a toll on the body. So as you can see, when we're talking about survivors, there's a lot that we have to look at as far as the grief process. I think the other thing we have to look at finally with the grief process is trying to understand what a person feels when they've lost someone to suicide. There's a lot of feelings. I mean, we've talked about the guilt and the self-blame. We've talked about PTSD, which includes flashbacks and nightmares. We've talked a little bit about anger, but what a survivor feels is at times uncontrollable sense of anger. Something I've noticed with working with survivors is, that first year they have such denial and disbelief, and they feel extremely numb. The other thing that survivors feel is a very strong feeling of vulnerability. They oftentimes feel disorientated and feel like they're in a fog. I sometimes think that this is the shock they feel. There's really an exaggerated sense of responsibility for the death. And then, of course, we have the whole anger, shame, despair, betrayal, abandonment. The other thing that makes it, that they feel, and that makes it, the grief really difficult to work with, is they're obsessed by their need to find the meaning or a reason for why the suicide happened, especially if there wasn't a note. And quite frankly, people don't leave notes. More people are apt to not leave notes. And so this leaves the family just panicked and frantic. Our survivors feel like they're going crazy, and they're not. They're just grieving in a world that doesn't understand the complicated grief that happens with a completed suicide. Well, my name is Tyler Woods, the Executive Director for Survivors of Suicide Tucson. You can get a hold of us at www.sostucson.org. You can also email us at sostucson@aol.com. Feel free to call us at 520-861-6632. We would like to thank our sponsors this week, Adam D Technology.